Welcome, everyone, and greetings from Philadelphia, where I am located. My name is Jacob Torkelson. I'm a senior research associate at the University of Pennsylvania's Weitzman School of Design, where I, along with a team of researchers under Professor Randy Mason, operate the Urban Heritage Project, a research and practice group that works on issues at the intersection of preservation, planning, and landscape. These days, we're mostly working on cultural landscape projects of various kinds, often partnering with the National Park Service and increasingly in collaboration with the communities in which we work. I've got a few housekeeping and administrative items to take care of here at the front of the presentation, and then I'll introduce my great colleagues here today. Today's conversation is part of a series of virtual discussions ramping up to the Fall Symposium on November 14th and 15th here in Philadelphia, which will think through cultural landscape practice from a few different perspectives, exploring where we are as a community of cultural landscape practitioners, researchers, citizens, and where we're going into the future. Our conversation will be about an hour or so today, including some questions and answers at the end. So please also note that this event is being recorded. So please share the news, this news with colleagues who couldn't join us today, and follow the Urban Heritage Project, website and Instagram page for the latest on the conference, which my colleagues will drop in the chat later. Lastly, you'll note both a question and answer tab and a chat tab at the bottom of your screen. Please place all questions in the question and answer tab and all comments in the chat tab. To start, if you could comment in the chat on where you're joining from today, that would be great for everybody involved in today's call. Now, I have the distinct pleasure to be joined by Samantha Odegard and Brenda Williams for a discussion on inclusion and collaboration in cultural landscape practice. For the sake of time, I'm going to read shortened bios of these two brilliant individuals, so please see their longer bios online. And both Brenda and Sam will also follow up my formal introductions with their own words. So to start, Samantha Odegard is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Upper Sioux Community, part of the Dakota Oyate in Granite Falls, Minnesota. Sam is first and foremost a Dakota woman, and the history and culture and responsibilities of that guide everything she does. She works tirelessly to care for the culture of her people through the preservation of tribal historic properties and cultural traditions. Through this work, she frequently interacts with design professionals and municipalities and other regulatory agencies through formal consultation as well as collaboration. Brenda Williams, FASLA, is a principal. Oops, excuse me, I put my notes over the camera. Sorry about that. Is a principal and landscape architect at Quinn Evans. Over more than 3 decades as a landscape architect, Brenda has focused her passion and empathy for understanding human connections to landscapes, developing methods to support, strengthen, and adapt significant landscapes for the people to whom they are meaningful. Her work to acknowledge, celebrate, and protect significant Indigenous sites has facilitated the creation of a new type of dialogue between groups culturally connected to landscapes and those positioned to guide their management. With generous guidance from tribal representatives, she has honed practices for the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in guiding, planning, and design associated sites. Brenda, Sam, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you for some opening remarks.
Go ahead, Brenda.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Sam. Yeah, I just wanted to start off by thanking the University of Pennsylvania and your program there for creating this space for this conversation and doing the work to get this all set up. I'm really looking forward to the symposium in November. And I just wanted to share, Jake mentioned that I practice in the world of cultural landscapes. I live in Madison, Wisconsin, and that is the home of the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin. And I work hard with members of the Ho-Chunk Nation and with other organizations and people, not just within the state of Wisconsin, but beyond that as well. And I just have to express my gratitude for everything I've learned, not just from them, but from many other tribal representatives that have given me the opportunity to come to you, to ask you to think about how you include and work with tribal knowledge in the things that you do. So, Sam, go ahead.
My name is Samantha Odegard. My Dakota name is Waduta Yuhayankewi, and I'm honored to be here. I like to take opportunities like this to work with, I hope, future colleagues I talk with and share some of the experience that we've had. I kind of look at knowledge or the life experiences that we have as not being just for ourselves, but it's about what you can do for the people around you or the people coming in the future. So I really appreciate the opportunity and the ask to be part of this and to be part of this conversation and hopefully visiting some of you in November.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Brenda. As we begin and transition to our conversation today, our hope with our talk on inclusion and collaboration is to empower practitioners and collaborators to undertake this work, as both Sam and Brenda have mentioned. While our conversation today is focused on Indigenous communities, I'm certain everyone working in cultural landscapes can learn from our conversation and collaborate with communities broadly, Indigenous people, other users, descendants, and more. Sam and Brenda, I promised to wrap up this intro as soon as possible, but I did want to note we've divided our conversation today into 3 broad themes. Each will be about 15 minutes. The first is, what is an ethical collaborative practice based on? What we're calling the why. Second, how do we approach collaborative practice? What we're calling the how. And lastly, a conversation on how cultural landscape work is only part of the greater processes. So that's what we're calling the next. To begin, I want to talk about repair and respect. Sam, I'll put the first topic to you. In our conversations together, you've talked about repairing narratives, repairing history, particularly the idea of stolen history. One entry to this work, as we've discussed, is revising how we write history, using the present tense and not the past when referring to Indigenous peoples, for example. I've heard from many frustrated professionals who don't know where to turn for this information, that there's not enough current sources, and that they're seeking out Indigenous place names that they cannot find. I guess I'll put to you, what would you say to these people when they ask this question?
I think the first thing to ask is, why do you want to know? Why do you want this information, or why do you feel that you need it? And that it kind of brings it back to this more of an Indigenous way of thinking, and that's why I put it that way, is that view on knowledge and who should have it and who has access to it, who owns it. Those are all things that I think people should look at first. Obviously, there's a long history and a complicated history of why some of those things aren't readily available. They have to do with the history of, like you said, stolen history and erasure, but some of that is by choice of Indigenous people. That we don't willingly share everything, and that understanding the reasons for that and being respectful of that is being respectful of us and that history. I mean, I could go on for a bit about that, but I think something like understanding your own motivation and looking at where the benefit and your knowledge of that particular subject or location or history, where that benefit is going.
Yeah, Jake, do you mind if I just tag on to that a little bit? I think, Sam, one of the things that we've talked about in the past is it's super important for us before we go and ask people to share with us that we've done our homework, that we have invested in learning everything we can so that we are not coming to you or other folks like you with an empty basket and asking you to fill it up for us. So if we can come with as much as we possibly can, and then you know sh- let you know that what have we looked at, and maybe a list of things that we're planning to like look at, that's really helpful because you can then respond to that. And I think the other thing we've talked about a little bit is that a lot of times you're doing a multitude of you're getting requests from so many different um voices, I'll say. And they each have their own priorities. And so when we go to you, to be able to understand that we are not necessarily your first priority, and also that if the more context we can give you about, like you were saying, why we're asking these questions, if we can explain what we're trying to achieve, it can possibly help you direct us to the right sources or the right people, but it also can be a more efficient process, which oftentimes um, is really critical because time is such a valuable commodity right now.
Yep. And I would just add, as we have more conversation about this, it might seem like this double-edged sword. So we say, have the information that you can, do whatever research you can or gain the knowledge you can before coming to us, but also know that when you come to us with that, we might say, yeah, that's wrong. So but even having gone through that process, then you you still have that some kind of footing, some kind of base to work with, even if we tell you now flip that upside down, because we're gonna share the real history with you. But I would just keep that in mind for anyone doing this work.
And I think Sam knows that's happened to me quite a few times. And I think one of the really important things that I've learned about that is so first of all, it is really important to understand the multitudes of um, inappropriate or untrue narratives that are out there. Like the more you understand those, the more you can kind of understand that the difficulty that a particular community might have in communicating what is their true voice today. But also there's that addition of I guess humility, not taking it personal or feeling like, wow, I did all this work and I learned things, and now you're telling me those things are wrong and I'm just frustrated or angry about that or something. I think it's really, really important to set your ego aside and be willing to admit I got it wrong, and then, ask what is the work that I can do to improve and get it right in the future.
Yep. And no matter how frustrated you might get, know that we're probably a lot more frustrated. Sorry, I had to edit myself. I almost swore there. Um, and part of that is when you get into this work, you do have to have a caring for the people kind of approach. It might not seem that way. It might just seem pretty cut dry. Here's historic facts. Here's what's not there. But when you're working with Native people, that's not how it goes. There's a lot of interwovenness and this whole cycle of thing that you kind of get thrown into, and thinking of the humanity of it and thinking of the people and why we have a more emotional connection to a what might seem like a simple topic is an important part of the work.
Brenda, I think one way you framed it, or perhaps you and Sam have framed it, is listening in a slightly different way. Can you describe what you mean by that approach?
Sure. I guess that seems very much like it comes from us. But I think what I probably mean by that is that beginning to understand that the perspectives of communities who are different from the community that is your own are not yours. And so because they're not yours and because it's not your culture, I do not ingrain into as easily into my brain the information that is being shared with me. And so frequently it takes a real conversation, a real dialogue. You're absorbing things that are very different than what you might be used to. And when you do that, it's really important to either ask more questions or to restate the way you're understanding it, so that you can be corrected, because I'm not like the sharpest crayon in the box, but it takes a lot to understand. And then I think the other piece is, at a certain point, if you think you understand, it's also likely that your depth of understanding is not the same as it is. Like if Sam and I are talking about Minnesota Dakota culture or meaning around a project, I will never have her knowledge. I will never have the knowledge of any person who was raised in that culture. And so when I am listening, I'm also like, I'm learning, and I'm learning maybe what the triggers are for when I need to ask more questions, rather than um here's like the answers and I can just take those answers and go apply them in some way, because in every situation there's going to be some subtleties that I need to double check back with. Does that hit on what you were touching on, Jake? Oops, we can't hear you, Jake.
Sorry about that. It does answer my question, Brenda. And Sam, I don't know if you would add anything to that point about listening in a slightly different way.
No, I think that it's kind of something that's interwoven in some of the stuff I've already been saying. It's, you're dealing with a living culture that is sometimes very different than what's been perceived of us, or what you're interacting with normally. So listening in that different way, I think, is listening to that, and also remembering that, for some of this, like, we're seen as the experts, or we're saying that we know a lot, but for many of us, we're also still learning. We're still reconnecting, especially if you're dealing with sacred sites that we've been removed from. Where part of the work that we're doing is that reconnecting and revitalizing our culture. So yeah, I think there's that approach of going into it as more of a humanitarian thing than it is a research project or whatever other way you might categorize it.
Brenda, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, as a practitioner, what is our responsibility to this work? How is an inclusive approach different or similar to the standard practices, and just kind of why it's important, sort of taking that step back for our listeners here.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. So one of the to me most important things is that um, when we approach people and ask them to share with us information about their culture, no matter how much we feel like we're doing that for maybe their benefit or society's benefit as a whole, when they respond and share information about their culture with us, they are giving us a gift. And that gift is often something that comes, sharing that gift is painful many times. And so once that has occurred, we have a real responsibility to honor that gift and to use it in a way that is either affecting positive change or is protecting the cultural value or elements in the world that are associated with that. So that's like a big one for me. And then I think also another piece of the responsibility is that when information or guidance is shared with us, that it's not ours. We don't own it. We can't share that openly without asking for permission. And when it is shared, we should always give people or ask for them to review and to make sure that our presentation of it is still aligned with the intent. And then also to use it again in another situation. It's a little bit different than what we're used to in our sort of professional and academic practices. You know, we think of, well, if someone gave us a piece of information, then we can footnote it in another document and use it again, or talk about it in another environment. And because this is cultural information, that is oftentimes not appropriate. So we need to check with people and understand, you know, why, like when they share something with us, what is that understanding of like what we're going to do with that information and how far does that permission extend?
Sam, I know you'll have something to say in response to that, so please jump in.
Oh, definitely. And I think that falls into that category of sometimes it's okay to share the knowledge, sometimes it's not. It could be and every site or everything can be different. Every setting can be different based on who's doing the work, who the intended audience is. And it's you might learn a lot from one project and you might have another project a quarter mile down the road and it seems like it's the exact same thing, but it can be extremely different. And that's why it's important to have, you know, that Indigenous perspective involvement on each one, because that's up to us. That's our responsibility to decide what should and shouldn't be shared. And I know that can be frustrating. You know, people want to know why a site is important, why it's considered sacred, or why it's culturally significant. And that's not all, that answer isn't always going to be there. That isn't always going to be something that we're able or even willing to share. So there's also a way to work with that, because there's other things that you can do and you can focus on without divulging those things that shouldn't be divulged. It can be talking about a little bit of education about, so why is this sacred site now a park? Or, you know, if it is as if sorry, if it is someplace that's open to the public and we now have access to media, meaning the general public, then how should they behave, or how should they respect this place in a way that the original people would have, or at least similar to it? That's something that can be very hard, but that's also something that it's its own form of education, its own form of why that also needs to get out there. And I think I've seen an example of that a little bit in Hawaii. I was there on a trip and they had a location that they had a sign, people could go past it, they could follow the trail, they can go into this area, but the sign specifically said that when this was built, when it was in use by Native Hawaiians, it was restricted to only certain people, and the consequences if other people happen to go into that area. So again, it doesn't necessarily stop people, but it was enough for me to recognize something and have that respect. And we stopped and we're like, nope, we'll go the other way. So sometimes just something that simple can be just as meaningful.
Sam, I wonder, in our discussions, we've spoken at length about oral history, and how writing it down often or can possibly change the meaning. I wonder if you could touch off on that.
Yeah, I can touch on a little bit, and I think that Brenda and I know you guys were part of that conversation, so feel free to expand or ask me to elaborate. But when it comes to our oral histories, they were told at a specific time for specific reasons to specific people, and that person who was sharing that was on them to know when those times were, when it was appropriate, and there was more control over that. Now, if you write it down, or if it gets recorded or whatever, then anyone can listen to it or read it at any time, and that takes some of that takes that significance of it away, but it also um, takes those things that have a certain context and are very specific to a time or place or a group of people and makes it common knowledge or general things that it doesn't quite fit. And one of the things, and that's a lot of times why we are so protective of things, because we've seen examples of, one person told it to someone who they thought they could trust or shared a story, and that person then wrote it down and published it. Or we see it, being brought up in movies and books like 100 years later, and sometimes it's either totally inaccurate in how it's been twisted or it's super inappropriate.
Yeah, same. I'll just share an example, and um that was a an elder who was explaining to me that um each time a story is shared, the way the story is told is directly affected by the relationship between the person the story is being told to, or a group of people, and the person or group of people who are telling that story. And so I think that was like, this was the time when I started to kind of better understand, because of course, with my background, I was like, we got to write them all down so we don't lose them. But the explanation was a grandmother today who was explaining to me how she would tell a story to her grandchild today. And she would be using words and referring to things that her grandchild today, like her computer and her laptop and all of those things, that this woman's grandmother would never have been referring to when she was telling the story to her, but she's making it something that her grandchild can relate to. And she's also, she understands that child as a person and understands not just the words, but the type of presentation that is going to be absorbed by her best. And that was like a little bang in my head that went off when I was shared, that was shared with me. So,
Well, Sam and Brenda, I think we could talk about the why of this work all day. I'd like to shift this, however, to the how. So how do we approach collaborative practice? My first question, I think, will be for Brenda. As a practitioner, could you offer some advice on starting points for inclusive and collaborative practice?
yeah, sure. So I guess I want to start with saying that they're really, so this isn't rocket science. And while there's also like not really any easy solutions, but the advice is really kind of simple. It seems like common knowledge. It doesn't seem like a big deal until you like really think about doing it kind of with your heart and soul and with authenticity, I guess. And then I think the other thing that is really important to understand is, while it may seem like common practices that we're going to just talk about a few different things, it is hard. It is hard work. We already have touched on a couple of things about how this is personal to a lot of individuals you're working with. Many times we're talking about histories that are just really horrible and very, hard to live with, and people don't want to dwell on that, right? So it is hard work, and like one of the most important pieces, I think, is to really make sure that your heart's in it, because there's kind of not any excuse for asking other people to engage in this work with you, and then for not really effectively moving forward with what is shared with you. So a couple of little tidbits that I'll share, and then I think Sam and I will kind of go back and forth a little bit on this. But um, I guess I want to just emphasize that uh, including the people to whom places are significant um, in the work that we do, or the people who are going to use these places that will be significant to them. I feel like that is vitally important, and that it's not an add-on. It is really, it should be like base practice integrated into that work. And so really thinking about that. And then also when we can, establishing relationships ahead of time so that those are in place before um, before we are involved in a particular project or work. And so that is, us as practitioners, but it also is our clients. And in a lot of ways, our relationships with our clients and our potential clients for the future, um, and other people who are out in the world doing this work, those relationships are opportunities for us to encourage people who are managing or making decisions about how Indigenous land, which is all land, is managed, that they are thinking a little bit deeper about, you know, not making the assumption that because a particular cultural group is not present today, that this isn't a place that's important to them. And so remembering that and trying to really do due diligence in finding who a place might be important to before you dive in and start doing the work. So one of the starting points is to really acknowledge and define and understand your own cultural defaults and motivations. So what do I mean by that? Let's see, one example would be that in writing about history, I think most of our disciplines have trained us to call Indigenous history prehistory. And to me, pre implies that it was before everything started. And that just simple professional term that we all use a lot is undermining the history and the importance of anyone who we are putting in that pre-category. It's just a little one. We can go through a couple others, but I'm going to pause for a minute and just see if Sam wants to jump in and touch on any of these.
Yeah, even defining our own defaults and motivations, we have them as well. It might be a totally different direction that we're coming from, but obviously I'm involved with this for a reason. Yeah, like I want our history to be told to some extent. I want access. I want people to know that maybe they shouldn't have access. That sites shouldn't necessarily be open to everybody. I'm also someone who is I feel like there's been a lot of erasure of Dakota history, especially in Minnesota and to the states east and to the south of that. So one of my motivations for doing this work and attending all the the meetings and stuff that I do or participate in projects that I do is to get that accurate history out there, get that as she said, pre-contact history out there. And so yeah, like I said, we have those too. And hopefully everyone's there for the right reasons and right motivations.
So I'm gonna jump to another one that I think is super important, and that is building flexibility into our processes. So when I start working with a new client who maybe has not worked a lot with Indigenous people, I like to make sure that they, and even partners, everyone who's at the table, I like to make sure that they're prepared. That at some point in the process, it's highly likely that we will be asked to do something that the response might normally be, it's not in the scope, it's not in the schedule, we don't have time or money to do that. And I like to talk to people about that because I think that that moment in time in the project is oftentimes the moment when we, if we truly listen and we have that flexibility to pivot and possibly either reassign resources or adjust schedules or consider how, how we can incorporate whatever request that is, that is the moment when we're actually doing that real reciprocal work, Jake, that you refer to, that we are not just simply checking a box for whether it's engagement or compliance, that we are informing the work we do with those requests, even if they seem like they're not directly related to what we started out doing. So I think that's a big one. I don't know if you want to follow up on that, Sam.
Yeah, and I think my work with Brenda, our Upper Sioux's work with Brenda, has had at least two good examples of that I know of, and some of that again I keep referring back to other parts of our conversation, but that understanding this more complex history, that in today's world we think that certain things must have been covered already or must have been done, but that's not always the case. Sometimes this might be the first chance that Native people might actually have to share their history from their point of view or be involved in a specific way, and that usually does create a longer timeline that's needed. Or sometimes it can lead to conflict between people from that area or people that have involved and the other tribal people that you're bringing in. I'm sure Brenda knows I'm referring to Indian Mounds Park in St. Paul, where things were getting contentious. There was probably about to be some words and some altercations, and so they were able to step in and recognize that and put the project on pause and give everyone a chance to calm down and really reevaluate that approach. So I use that as an example because I think understanding that there might be conflict is also something that's really important. And there was something else I was going to lead into that, but that relates, I think, to some of the other things like considering the emotional implications and listening and being respectful and of that. So anything else you want to add on to that? Otherwise, I was going to jump into incorporating tribal members in the design team.
Please.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So one of the things that you might find if you're working on cultural landscapes is that there's varying levels of tribal involvement or consultation. And in some ways, it is something you have to be aware of. So there might be a name that's well known or someone within a certain area, but sometimes they might not even be Native, but they might identify as. Whichever case that is, there's always more to it than that. Just because one person might be seen as a go-to for knowledge, that doesn't mean that they're representative of a tribe or a different group. So for me, as a tribal historic preservation officer, yes, I am designated by my tribal council to represent the Upper Sioux community. That doesn't mean that I know everything or I have the most knowledge, but it means that I at least have that official designation. So you'll have to be careful about how you're stating that. That, like I said, just because you have one tribal person, that doesn't mean you have tribal engagement. A better way would it? There probably has a better way to explain that, but feel free to jump in.
Well, Sam, I'm glad you brought that up, and I think there's a couple of other layers of discussions that we've had and experiences. So, I think one thing, like if there is a best practice for me, it is that anytime we're trying to decide who we should either have as a collaborator, um, even if it's an artist who's going to collaborate with us and they are, say, a Dakota artist, I would always touch base with the typos from not just one. Remember that many of the places where we are doing work have associations with multiple different tribes because of the way that tribes have been have moved and been displaced and sometimes moved of their own accord, but much more often been moved. And so because of that, I go first to the TIPOs and I ask them, for their recommendations. Some tribes don't have TIPOs, and if they don't, if there isn't a cultural heritage division, then I go to tribal council and ask them, who are the people that you feel like would be the right people for us to interact with? So that's one piece. And then the other piece, now it's my turn to forget, Sam. So if anything popped into your head while I was saying that, so I think for a second.
Brenda, maybe that ties into the
Okay.
developing ongoing relationships point and reciprocity.
Yeah. So I do, I think I kind of jumped ahead on some of that earlier and talked about knowledge being shared. And then we have touched on, us as people doing this work, building relationships, and also on encouraging, one little I will say it was something I realized at a certain point is that I might build really powerful relationships with the people I'm working with, but then I leave. I'm a consultant. And so one of the things that has, really become very important and apparent is that sometimes part of our job is helping our the people who are there making decisions, uh helping them build those relationships, right? Um, and then I do remember now, this is kind of not exactly in the right sequence, but I'm going to pull it in because when Sam was talking, I thought of this, and that is, she was talking about when people are disagreeing, and if you have like those polarized positions where people really feel like they come into the room kind of pitted against each other because they feel like they're opposed in making certain decisions. And this is where I think our skills as professional designers or planners are very valuable, because that is a time when the people who are there and have very emotional connections to these places, it is very hard for them to be able to compartmentalize that, to have the discussions. But when we can talk about the thing that everyone in the room has in common, which is they care about this place, or they care about a connection to the place, And when we can give everyone that sort of the base, whatever that common thing is, if everybody has that, they can begin to respect the other people's positions. And the thing that has blown me away many, many times is that once we get to that place, those things that felt like compromises before oftentimes are not even necessary, because oftentimes we can, like, through working through it together, realize that the pieces that are non-negotiable to one group are more flexible to another, and vice versa. And then also, by learning about uh, why something is so important to a certain group, then people's understanding and thinking also begins to change. And then there's the opportunity, this window opens for being able to go in a new direction altogether. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone into situations where I've been like, we're never going to find a resolution where, you know, people are going to come together on this. And again, if we find that common ground, it's just amazing. It happens.
Brenda and Sam, I'm going to jump in here for just a second to speak to our audience. Please, as a reminder, add your questions to the Q&A section, where our moderators behind the scenes will share them with us. Brenda and Sam, I know we have a ton of points on how we might approach this work. And as I'm looking over our notes, so many of these overlap and touch on the other. And, you know, I think from the questions we've got so far, I feel like, you know, we can put a pin in this section for now and maybe move on to the next section, which has to do with the what's next. And selfishly, Sam, I posed this question to you in our conversation that, you know, cultural landscapes, you know, it's not the most perfect term. When I got into this work and when I heard about your work with Brenda, I kind of shook my head and thought, you know, what is it about cultural landscapes that really works? And so I want to put that to you, and I wonder about your reaction when you first came across it, and now why you think cultural landscapes is the way to go.
Sure. And when we were talking, I shared the story that when I first heard the term, I absolutely had no idea what it was. I was literally thinking like landscaping, and so it took me a little while. But once I started to understand, then it made more sense. Like I said, it is hard to try to define this work or these locations, and there's never been a term that I found that's ever fit, even come close. You know, a lot of times that's being looked at through an archaeological lens or through a historic lens, and that's not what it is either. So I've actually found that a cultural landscape, understanding that landscape is the location, not necessarily what plants are being taken care of there, but um, I find it actually seems to be a bit more similar to how we describe it or how our perspective of a place is, because it's not just these one little bits and pieces. It is this whole broader approach, and it's everything that's connected to it. And I find it similar to, for anyone that has like an archaeological background or, you know, working with the National Park Service, we have the traditional cultural place or traditional cultural property survey kind of work that's being done, or designation. And I find that a cultural landscape, the term cultural landscape probably mixes with that a bit better. But again, that's me mixing, you know, all the fields that I work with and all the different hats that I wear. So yeah, it works for now. I'll put it that
Well, I bet your head is getting heavy with all of its hats.
way. That's why I'm like this all the time.
Brenda, I have a note, or actually, I'm sorry, Sam, I have a note here that you had a question for Brenda. Would you like to ask that, or I can ask it on your behalf since it's right in front of me?
So when we were having these conversations and preparing for this one, something had popped into my head, and I had actually asked Brenda about any times that she had done this work without having Native partners or tribal partners involved. So I'd like you to share that with the group if you could, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it has happened many times. And there's a few examples that I think there's a variety of different types of examples. So I think in work that we did many years ago with Cahokia, and maybe a little bit more recently with Hopewell Culture. In both of those instances, the institutions we were working with had strong relationships with tribes, and this isn't an unusual situation where because they have those strong relationships, they're reluctant to have the consultant who, like I was expressing, we come in and then we go away. And so having us interact directly with the tribes, well, that can be considered a potential for harming those relationships. It can also be considered a time commitment that the tribal members would have to put in when they've already kind of got this agreement that they're working directly with the site, the organization, or the agency. And so, in those cases, there's a certain level of frustration because we it is hard, like that thing that I was talking about, where when we bring people together, the same is true when we work directly with the people who are from the cultural group that we're focused on, that if it's coming from a third party, it is very hard to capture appropriately and accurately the true meaning, and also then to have that informed decision making when you are in a process of design or planning where you're really trying to integrate that. So certainly that has been a real challenge, and I think it has, as Sam and I have talked about that in a variety of different ways. One of the things that we've had some good experiences with is having more individuals who Sam can recommend as people who can join these projects in different ways. So absolutely, she is at the table when it's consultation, government to government consultation. When we are in the process of designing or planning, and we need historical knowledge or language knowledge or plant knowledge or knowledge of symbology and artistic expression, there are many people, not many, but there are many people that she can recommend who can come aboard and collaborate with us about that type of knowledge in a way that really changes the process of design or planning. And then we're still interacting with her office and the other TIPOs, but it's a little bit of a lighter lift sometimes. And I think, Sam, if you want to talk about, if we can go into this, Jake, the thinking about the requirement, because then eventually cultural landscape work that's focused on Indigenous places or other places that have culturally associated groups that have living populations today, that work should be led by those people. And so we were talking about, well, what are ways to get those people educated in this field? And then Sam with her brilliant brain, opened up this door of maybe I should have realized it a long time ago, but I'll let you talk about it, Sam.
Wait, which idea was that?
It was the idea about why are we having people that have to be trained to do it like a certain way and keeping them in that box, rather than why don't we look to people who have this knowledge and find ways to open up this discipline of work to be able to find ways to have them incorporated in
the work that's being done.
Yeah.
And I mean, this was a conversation, that I'd had early on with Brenda about how do we have more Native people doing this work? Are the feeling by her and other colleagues that it should be Native people? And before I get into that, I also want to say that, sometimes it doesn't always have to be us. And that's the role and importance of a good ally, and taking on some of that workload and addressing some of those difficult topics before we even come to the table. So I will say that I think it is important to have Native voices involved, but that doesn't mean it has to be exclusive to Native people. But when it comes to bringing more people in general, I found, and this probably comes from working in a Native country where nonprofits and tribal governments and all this stuff where we're all doing a bunch of different things, is that what we're trained in, what we went to school for, isn't necessarily what we end up doing. And that probably is familiar with a lot of other people too, not just us. But there could be someone that has the knowledge that you need or you want to have involved, that could be going to school for history or anthropology or archaeology, but they could be doing something totally different. They could be an artist, or they could be going to school for language revitalization, all these other things. And so you can reach out that way and just getting involved with student groups in general or professional groups. We can also build those relationships within the community, and I think, Brenda, do you guys want to get into that idea of having someone on retainer or ways to contribute to other people that have that knowledge?
Yeah.
So one of the other things, like I said, we have these conversations. Like I said before, we're still working a lot of this out. This isn't something there's a handbook on how to do this. It's being developed. So actually, one of those things is, how do we bring these people in, but then how do we acknowledge, and especially if we're saying that you can't talk to us one time and take that knowledge and use it for everything in the future. So how do we respect that and bring people in repeatedly and compensate them adequately for their time and the knowledge that they share? And culturally, there's protocols to that, and there might be some people who refuse any kind of payment, but you can still find ways to take care of them, making sure their travel and things are covered. But one of the ideas we had was, maybe for certain areas, you have someone on retainer, because if they're doing this work and it's not guaranteed, they also need to have a source of reliable income and be able to provide for themselves and their families. So Brenda kind of had the idea, I think, from a coworker, is almost kind of like how you would have like a lawyer or someone on retainer. They're given a certain amount and they can be a go-to person to ask certain questions or to give the basics. But if they get more involved in the project, then that gets written in, and more of their time is compensated. Brenda, if you wanted to cover that a little bit more.
I think you hit it really well. Yeah, I don't think I need to add more to that other than just it's kind of a seed of an idea. But I think it's one that really warrants a lot more consideration.
Yep. So when we haven't done yet, but maybe the next time we have a conversation like this, we'll.
Yeah, maybe by November we'll have an example. That would be so cool.
Sam, I think just to bring that point home, one of the things you've mentioned is, we do land acknowledgements, or maybe not we do land acknowledgements, but folks have been doing land acknowledgements. But what does it really mean? Something like this would get to really put that land acknowledgement into practice.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, and that's a question that's going on right now. I mean, actually, just a couple hours ago, I read an article that talked about a certain group of native anthropologists that said, stop doing land acknowledgements. Like how, because they don't know if they've actually been helpful or useful. Um, that's, you know, taking that next step and saying, okay, more than just acknowledging who has been here, how do we acknowledge their contribution and their involvement and their connection now, and something like that, recognizing that there might be someone who doesn't have more than an eighth grade education, but their knowledge level is beyond that of 10 PhDs because just who they are and the way that they've been raised and the knowledge that they have. But yeah, that's definitely one of the ways that you can go beyond just making a blanket acknowledgement and actually recognizing the value of Indigenous people and the knowledge that we carry.
And I'll jump in here for just a second to say to our viewers, we realize it is 3. We're going to go on for just a few more minutes here after the hour and take your questions. So for those of you that can stay, great. For those of you that have to sign off, we will have this recording available online. Sam, I think this would be a really good opportunity to tie sort of another way that we can put land acknowledgements into practice is talking about and identifying a landscape for what it really is. And the example you provided to Brenda and me is in your work at the Indian Mound Cemetery is that burials are no longer allowed there.
Right.
I wonder if you can, without that being a question, I wonder if you can respond or take that from here.
Yeah, part of acknowledging these places is what they've been for literally thousands of years, and most of them. We use Indian mounds as an example. There's thousands of them around the country, but the place was recognized as significant. We started to bury our relatives there many, many, many generations ago. And it's been less than 200 years that we've not been able to do that, and even if you look at the written history, the first accounts of people coming to the area, they're referencing the burials. And so now, we come in, we consulted on it, and we're having to focus on teaching other people what it really is, that it's not a place to walk your dog or to go sliding off the mounds. And so, yeah, that's a step. But it's something that's taken a lot of work. I mean, there's generations of people before me that got to the point that we could be brought in and have that conversation. But that doesn't necessarily mean there isn't a long way yet to go. And that's kind of that reference of not everything should be necessarily open to the public. So with Indian Mounds, although that's a place that we've buried our relatives probably for hundreds of generations, that it's not something that we can continue to do now. Yeah, that's a conversation, but we don't even have full control over it. We get brought in to consult. And we've had conversations about doing more repatriation there. So reburying the people that originally came from those mounds and were dug out. But we're hesitant to even do that because we can't guarantee that they'll be continually protected because it's not under our control. Or that it wouldn't become like some kind of a circus where everyone wants to come watch the natives do a ceremony. So yeah, that's one of my soapbox. I can go on for that, go with that for a long ways. But yeah, that ties into that. Yeah. That acknowledgement of what a place is just the first step, and there's still a long ways to go.
Sam, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I've heard you say this many times, and I just want to share it because it's been very powerful to me to hear. This work that we've done together, you've reminded me, it's always a compromise for you. Do you want to just explain what that means?
Yeah. Again, we, even if they say his land was ceded or whatever, we never really fully gave up our lands. And even if we were forced to sign a treaty or cede over territory, it's not with an understanding that we would never have access to these places again. We've never have access to the burials of our mothers and fathers or grandparents. And so much has been done since then that has desecrated these places, that when we come to the table, when we have these conversations, we're not starting as equals. We're already way back here in some senses, because I think like the Niemels, the example I used was, I don't know of any other people that doesn't have the complete control or say over their burials. That if you go to a Catholic cemetery or a military cemetery, you're not, it's not a public place that, oh, wait, let's consult with them and see how maybe we can be a little bit more respectful. So we're already coming from a place that just having to be there is already a compromise, and we're having to give up. We've already lost so much, and we're still having to give up ourselves just to try to get to that table or have some say and some control. So I think hopefully that answers that.
And I'll just sort of, because the steps are reminding me that where we all need to kind of feel like we're doing something good. And that's the other thing you've said to me. We're taking a step in the right direction. It's not that we're not. And it is really important to be doing that, because the more we do it, even inch by inch, it's getting, it's moving the needle a little bit in the right direction. And the more different places that happens, the more visible it is, the more understandable it is, and then the more likely it is to be happening in more and more impactful ways.
Sam and Brenda, I hate to pause our conversation there, but I will. I have pages of notes, and I'm very excited to continue this conversation in person in November. If you're up for it, we have 3 questions here in the Q&A. So I'll pull up the first one. This comes from Sarah, who asks, she says, the time and commitment that is required to understand a culture that is different from one's own is usually not included in project timelines. How do you address that with the funding entities? And I'll add on to that, and maybe I'll put it to you, Brenda, first. We talk a lot about, or you and I have talked a lot about scope and how this really starts with scoping. So I will put that question to you.
Yeah, sure. I'll start there. I think one of the things that has been incredibly important is when we are able to also develop relationships with those potential clients, the people who manage or have control over the care of these landscapes, that we help them really think about working with the tribes to develop their scopes of work, or having like what we've called pre-scoping meetings, in order to ensure that consideration for the learning that is necessary can be incorporated, and the timelines are appropriate, and that you can have the right people on board. So for Sarah, there's a lot of different ways, but one way to to really improve is, for instance, we just finished a cultural landscape report for Knife River Indian villages in North Dakota. I had never worked with the MHA, the Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, 3 affiliated tribes before. So it would have been a huge learning curve for us to be able to do that project if we did not have a tribal, a Hidatsa historian and an indigenous ethnobotanist on our team, as well as having advisors from the tribal community. And our Hidatsa historian did, a big part of his scope of work was doing oral history interviews with many different current community members, as well as basically being there with us, holding our hand through the whole project and helping us like figure out how to appropriately represent the information that was being shared by him. And I have also got to make sure I mention that the superintendent at that tribe is a Rikara. And so, her setting, the foundation really gave us an amazing jumping off point for that.
Sam, would you like to add anything in that? Yeah, you don't have to. I don't mean to put you on the spot. Great.
Not really. I mean, I think Brenda did very well on that.
Thanks, Sam.
Our next question comes from Daniel, who is asking about trust. That he's asking essentially that if this all comes down to trust and building that trust, how do we do that? And I don't know that there's an easy answer. He's asked for each of us to comment. And Daniel, I'm sorry if I didn't give your question justice here, but I think this goes to Brenda's point, and I'll stop talking here in a second. One of her very first points in this talk was that there is no magic formula for this. There is no easy process. And I'll put it back to you guys, if you like.
Yeah, I would say, yes, trust is definitely a big part of it and that relationship building. And recognizing that you're going to be working with different people. Like I said, I might represent my tribe officially, but that doesn't mean everyone in my tribe shares the same opinion. So it's never going to be the same approach. And you might have 80% of people that like you and trust you, and there will be some that don't. But I think the main things are the being willing to listen, the being willing to admit when or if you're wrong, and being adaptable are the biggest things. And showing that I'm sorry, showing that there's it has a deeper meaning to you as well. If that's the case, obviously, that plays a lot in that trust. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah. Our last question here is simply a request that if we could share the article about land acknowledgements. I can work with Brenda to track that down. I believe it was Brenda that mentioned it.
No, I did.
Oh, Sam, I'm so sorry. I'll get with you and you can send it to me to share with the group.
I have it handy if I could share the link in the chat if that works.
Perfect. Yeah, if you have it handy, that's great.
Yeah, because I it's left it up. It's actually from October of 2022. But yeah, it seemed a very interesting article to me. It's from PBS's NewsHour.
Cool. Sam and Brenda, I have one last question that was texted in to me from Randy on our team. If you'll indulge me a couple minutes longer. He asks, you've explained very directly the needs to keep Indigenous knowledge about places under Indigenous control. This contradicts the idea of public landscapes being fully transparent in terms of knowledge, access, and quote, ownership. Are there ways the NPS, states, counties, cities, etc., need to shift the expectations of what a quote public landscape is or what it does?
I would say yes, and I think actually some of those conversations, have started to happen. But ironically, there's this kind of weird thing of, things are already taken into account for wetlands and plant life or animal life. That I've been part of things where things are restricted for that reason, but yet restricted because it's a burial site or because it has to do with cultural significance for Indigenous people isn't even seem to be put on that level. Like it's still less than that. So I definitely think those are conversations that continually need to be had. And in all honesty, there's this concept of these places are open to the public or they're supposed to be for everybody, but we know that there's more to it than that, and not the whole public doesn't know about everything that's out there, about everything related to a national park or a state or local park. So yeah, I think it's just more about having deeper conversations and about being honest and opening up to why things need to be preserved and why things need to have as little of human footprint as possible.
Well, Brenda, Sam, just in wrapping up here, I could carry this on. We could talk more and more, but I think we'll need to conclude for now. I hope everybody else will join us in November. Keep an eye on the website, www.cultural-landscapes.org, as well as the Urban Heritage Project Instagram for more on that. My colleagues have dropped that in the chat. Sam and Brenda have also very generously compiled a list of books about the Minnesota Dakota cultural landscapes, and we'll drop that also in the chat as a series of resources. And Sam, I know you wanted to add something on those books as they're adding them here.
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to point out that on the list you'll have some that are edited or authored by Dakota people, Dakota historians that carry their PhD status and everything. And then there's also other ones like Through Dakota Eyes that they include our narrative, but they're not written by a Dakota person. So just remember that, even things that claim to have a Dakota narrative can sometimes be problematic when they're still being edited and controlled, and final say is by somebody else. So that's all I wanted to add.
Thank you. And for those listening, our next conversation will be on June 25th. Details to be released soon. This conversation will focus on MPS practice from a government perspective. So again, stay tuned to those channels I mentioned. And once again, please thank you. Please join me in the comments here in thanking both Sam and Brenda for that insightful, empowering, and really just energizing conversation. And I thank you both for the great work you're doing with each other, and then also to push all of us forward. So thank you both. And I don't want to have the last word, so if you'd like to have it, please do.
I'm just going to say thank you to Sam for joining us, and also to you, Jake, for pulling this together in your school. Really appreciate it. And yeah, I'm also looking forward to more conversations like this with you guys.
And I will just say Pidamia. So that's shorthand in my language. It just means you've done something to make me thankful. So I say that to all of you, both the ones that put this, sorry, I cannot talk. The ones that put this together, invited me to be on the panel, and those of you that are listening. And I'm glad to be part of it. And I don't know if you share contact information, but feel free to share my email if anyone needs to or would like to reach out and ask a question directly.
Great.
Thanks, you guys.
Until next time. Thank you.